Imagine a church packed with worshippers singing, praying, believing salvation is just moments away. Then the doors are locked, flames erupt, windows are barred, screams fill the air, and no one gets out. This wasn't a fire, it was an execution, and it was planned. In Uganda, a doomsday cult convinced hundreds that the world was ending, and when it didn't, they were silenced forever. But here's the twisted part. The cult didn't disappear. It simply changed form, and many say it became part of the very system that was supposed to stop it. What really happened in that church? Who was behind it? And why are so many of the killers still walking free? When I first heard about the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God, I assumed it was just another fringe religious group. Isolated, strange maybe, but harmless. It wasn't. This group had a message, and it spread like wildfire in rural Uganda during the late 1990s. Their promise was simple, yet terrifying. The world would end on December 31st, the year 2000. The only way to survive? Follow the 10 Commandments. To the letter, no exceptions. And people listened. The movement was founded by a former prostitute turned visionary named Credonia M. Werind and an excommunicated Catholic priest named Joseph Kibwetter. They claimed the Virgin Mary was speaking to them, that the apocalypse was coming, and that only their followers would be saved. But here's the first red flag. Followers weren't allowed to speak. Literally, they communicated using signs. They weren't allowed to have sex, even within marriage. They fasted constantly. And any questioning of leadership, punishable by death. So why did people stay? Maybe the better question is, what were they afraid of? By the end of 1999, the group had grown into the thousands. They'd bought land, built compounds, even opened their own schools. But something was off. Reports began trickling in from nearby villages. Parents were abandoning their children to join the cult. Whole families were vanishing, and those who tried to leave the compound, they never made it far. What's chilling is how organized everything was. This wasn't chaos. This was structure. Followers handed over all their possessions, gave up their homes, their bank accounts, even their land. They believed the leaders. They believed that January 1st would be the end of the world. And when that day came and nothing happened, that's when the real horror began. Because now the leaders had a problem. Hundreds of followers were starting to ask questions. And in this cult, questions were dangerous. On March 17th, the year 2000, over 900 members gathered inside a church in Kanungu, Uganda. They were told it was a celebration, a final feast before ascending to heaven. Witnesses saw livestock being slaughtered, music being played, dancing, laughter, even a massive banquet prepared. But then something shifted. The doors were shut, the windows covered. A strange smell filled the air, and then fire. Within minutes, the church was engulfed. Explosions from gasoline containers rocked the building. Witnesses from outside said they heard pounding, people begging to be let out. No one opened the doors. When investigators finally arrived, what they found was beyond comprehension. Charred bodies, piles of skulls. Some had clearly been stacked before the fire started, as if the blaze was just a final cover-up. But here's where it gets darker. This wasn't a spontaneous act of mass suicide. It was a murder plot, and it wasn't the first. Before the fire, there were signs. Weeks earlier, villagers living near the Kanungu compound reported something strange: supply trucks coming and going at night, large purchases of sulfuric acid, stockpiles of gasoline, and loud, urgent preaching echoing across the hills. Some said they saw people digging, not graves, but pits. Still, the local authorities did nothing. Why? That's the question that haunts this case. The cult had become so politically connected, so financially entrenched, that few dared to intervene. It was more than a movement now. It had power, protection, influence. And those who tried to sound the alarm, they vanished. One local teacher tried to file a report claimed children were being kept against their will. A week later, his house mysteriously burned down. He fled the district and never came back. Were these accidents, or was someone making sure the truth stayed buried? What happened in Kanangu wasn't isolated. As investigators searched the cult's other properties, they made a horrifying discovery. This wasn't the only mass killing. In several other compounds across Uganda, more bodies were found. One site had dozens of corpses buried beneath a school. Another had victims locked in a latrine pit, murdered and covered with dirt. Some of them were poisoned. Others were strangled. A few had signs of torture. Altogether, the death toll reached over 1,000. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. The cult leaders were gone. Not a single body recovered from the Kanangu fire was confirmed to be Credonia Mwerinde or Joseph Kibwetter. The masterminds behind it all had vanished. So the question remains, where did they go? And how did they escape while 900 people burned alive? In the weeks that followed the massacre, the Ugandan government scrambled for answers. Press conferences were held. Investigations were launched, but nothing concrete came out of it. No major arrests, no trials, no international pursuit of the cult's leaders. And here's the most chilling part: some survivors claimed the cult had help from officials. They spoke of secret meetings, police warnings that mysteriously never came, even rumors that high-ranking politicians had attended ceremonies at the compound before the fire. Was the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments more than just a cult? Was it a political machine? Some believe the group had infiltrated local government, using religion as a shield for something far more sinister. And while the world moved on, a silence settled over Uganda. The kind of silence that only comes when people are too afraid to ask questions. But I'm not done asking. And I don't think we're anywhere near the full truth yet. Credonia Mwerinde. To many followers, she was a prophet, a mouthpiece of the Virgin Mary, a woman chosen by heaven to guide the faithful through the apocalypse. But what was she really? Before founding the cult, Credonia was a failed businesswoman. She sold banana beer, worked as a sex worker, and was widely known in her village, not for holiness, but for hustling. Then something changed. After her father died, a local mystic who claimed to see visions, Credonia suddenly claimed she could speak to spirits. She began gathering followers, mostly women, promising divine messages and eternal salvation. But behind closed doors, former insiders say she ruled with terror. Beatings were common, punishments brutal. Anyone who questioned her visions was isolated or worse, disappeared. Yet she had this uncanny ability to manipulate, to twist fear into devotion. And her partner in control. A man just as cunning but hiding behind a priest's robe. Joseph Kibwetter had once been a respected figure, a politician, a devout Catholic, a man of influence in Uganda's southwestern regions. But after a mental health breakdown in the 1980s, he disappeared from public life, only to reappear years later at Credonia's side. She called him a prophet. He claimed to receive visions. Together, they formed the leadership of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments. But there's something odd about Kibwetter. While Credonia was fiery and brutal, Kibwetter was quiet, more of a figurehead than a real leader. Some survivors said he looked afraid in private, controlled, even threatened. Was he a believer, or was he just another pawn? To this day, no one knows if Kibwetter died in that church fire or escaped with Credonia. His body was never positively identified, and if he survived, where is he now? The movement's doctrine was strange even by doomsday standards. They didn't just preach the 10 Commandments, they weaponized them. No lying, no sex, no work on Sundays, no use of soap, no talking. Breaking a single rule was treated as mortal sin. But instead of confession or forgiveness, punishment was swift and public. Some were starved, others were beaten. A few simply disappeared after speaking out. Followers were told that the Virgin Mary was watching, that Credonia had visions of their sins, that even thinking bad thoughts would doom their souls. And it worked. People lived in total fear. Families spied on each other. Children were turned against their parents. And all the while, the cult's leaders grew richer collecting land, money, even livestock in the name of God. But here's what I can't stop thinking. If the world didn't end, why didn't they simply walk away? Why did hundreds walk into that church and lock the doors behind them? Or maybe they didn't. Maybe someone else made that decision for them. In the days following the Kanangu fire, international media briefly turned its attention to Uganda. Headlines screamed about cult deaths. Comparisons were made to Jonestown. But unlike Jonestown, there was no cleanup. The church compound was never fully secured. Locals wandered through the wreckage. Evidence was trampled. Bodies were hastily buried or left exposed. And then the story vanished. The government stopped updating the death toll. No official national day of mourning was held. And strangely, no serious manhunt was launched for Credonia M. Warind or any surviving cult leaders. Why? Some say it was shame. Others say it was fear. But more and more, it started to look like a cover-up. One journalist who tried to investigate a Ugandan reporter named John Kigongo received threats. His car was vandalized. He eventually fled the country. Was the government protecting someone? Or was the cult never truly dismantled? You want to understand a cult. Follow the money. In the months before the massacre, the movement's leaders collected donations from thousands of members, promised them seats in heaven, took their life savings, their cattle, even their wedding rings, and then it all disappeared. No financial records, no trace of offshore accounts, but what has been found is strange. A handful of former followers claimed that a powerful businessman in Kampala was quietly funding the cult in exchange for land and influence. Another survivor alleged that military trucks had once delivered crates to the compound filled with clothing, food, and bizarrely envelopes of cash. But here's the kicker. Years later, multiple former government officials were seen living on land previously owned by the cult. Was that land confiscated legally or inherited by silence? Nobody ever answered those questions. And that silence, it speaks volumes. There weren't many survivors, but the few who did make it out carried stories that chilled me to the bone. One woman, Miriam, had left the compound 2 weeks before the fire. She said the mood had changed. Followers were afraid, whispering that the final day was near. She begged her sister to leave with her. Her sister said no, she believed the world would end, and she wanted to be with the Blessed Mother when it did. Her body was later found burned beyond recognition. Another survivor, a young man named Paul, had been punished for stealing food. He was tied to a tree outside the compound and left there overnight. That punishment saved his life. He watched the fire from the hills, heard the screams. He reported everything to police, and nothing happened. To this day, the survivors live in poverty. They speak about what they saw, but few listen. No books, no national memorials, no justice, just memories and nightmares. Most people assume the movement ended in 2000, But that's not what happened. In the years that followed, something strange began to surface. New religious groups began popping up in rural Uganda's small gatherings, preaching similar doomsday prophecies. Same language, same signs, same obsessions with silence, visions, and punishment. One group, operating in a village near Kesi's, was eerily familiar. Locals said their leader had once lived at the Kanangu compound and that he still referred to Credonia as the true prophetess. He claimed she had survived and that she would one day return. The government dismissed these new groups as harmless sects. But former cult researchers noticed something else. These groups weren't just surviving, they were expanding, buying land, preaching doomsday, gaining followers. So, was the cult destroyed? Or did it just change its name? By now, you're probably asking the same question I've been haunted by. Where is Credonia Mwerend? After the massacre, her name appeared on Interpol's wanted list. There were rumors she fled to the Congo. Others claimed she went underground in Kenya. Some believe she's dead. But no body was ever found, no confirmed sightings, just whispers. One investigator claimed she underwent surgery changed her appearance. Another believed she was being protected by a high-ranking religious official within Uganda. And then there are those who think she never left at all, that she simply disappeared into the very system she once defied. A few survivors even said they saw her years later dressed in plain clothes at a wedding standing in the back of the church, watching. No one dared approach. And maybe that's what she wanted, to be forgotten, erased, to let the fire take the blame while she vanished into smoke. Here's where things get truly dark. Multiple investigations, both local and international, hinted at something beyond cult ideology, something more structural. Documents recovered from the compound suggested the movement had connections with politicians, names of government officials, letters exchanged with police commanders, even handwritten schedules for private meetings in Kampala. Why would a doomsday cult need political contacts? Unless it was never just about religion. Some experts now believe the movement functioned like a shadow state, controlling land, controlling people, manipulating fear for influence. A few survivors even described moments when local police escorted cult leaders during processions, when complaints were ignored, when arrests mysteriously fell through. So we ask again, was this really a cult? Or was it a government-backed operation gone horribly wrong? Or worse, not wrong at all. To this day, the site of the Kanangu massacre is almost untouched. No memorial, no monument, just a hollowed-out church shell, scorched earth, and scattered bones buried beneath weeds. Locals say it's cursed, that no grass grows where the flames burned hottest. Some claim they hear voices at night screaming, praying, singing hymns in the dark. The Ugandan government labeled it an unfortunate tragedy. But I've seen the pictures. I've read the witness accounts. This wasn't tragedy. It was execution. And what haunts me the most is the precision, how methodical it was, how prepared, how silent. This wasn't a cult that collapsed under its own madness. This was a machine that ran exactly as it was designed. Think about what was lost. Entire families, whole communities, farmers, teachers, children, hundreds of lives reduced to ash, and with them the cultural and spiritual identity of a region already struggling with poverty, disease, and conflict. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments didn't just kill its members, it erased them. No proper funerals, no closure. In some cases, no names. Even today, the Ugandan education system barely mentions what happened. It's not taught, it's not spoken of. The children who survived orphaned, traumatized, grew up in silence. Many won't talk about it at all. What kind of wound does that leave behind? What happens when you survive horror and the world refuses to believe it happened? If we think this can't happen again, we're wrong. The blueprint that the movement used, fear, isolation, control, prophecy, still exists. It's being copied, remixed, used by other cults, even political regimes. And it works. The scariest part. Cults no longer need compounds. They don't need fires. They just need belief, blind, desperate belief. Online, offline, doesn't matter. And in countries where institutions are weak, where poverty is deep, where hope is scarce, belief becomes a weapon. So what if Credonia wasn't just a cult leader? What if she was a prototype? And what if the next church doesn't look like a church at all? No one was ever brought to justice for what happened in Kanangu. No trials, no convictions, not even a serious public inquiry. The case was quietly shelved, reduced to conspiracy theories and local ghost stories. But we still have questions. Where did the money go? Who protected the leaders? How did 900 people die in a locked building on a known compound with clear warnings and no one stopped it? The truth is somewhere out there. In old court files, in frightened testimonies, in the eyes of survivors who were never heard. But maybe the real question isn't what happened. Maybe it's this. What are we willing to ignore when the people in charge wear robes, not uniforms? If you're watching this, you've now seen what most people never will. Not because it's hidden, but because no one wants to see it. The cult that became a government wasn't a fluke. It was a system. One that preyed on fear, used faith as fuel, and burned its followers alive to silence their doubt. And to this day, no justice, no reckoning, no truth. So I'll leave you with a question. If 1,000 people can vanish into smoke and the world forgets, who's next? Because sometimes the most dangerous cults don't look like cults at all. They look like hope. And they speak with the voice of God.